For a very long time, there has been a debate as to whether or not Africans actually enslaved other Africans and sold them to the Europeans before and during the transatlantic slave trade. To better understand this whole concept of what really happened, it is important to go back memory lane. The truth is, slavery in all its forms existed in Africa way before the coming of the Europeans and the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. Africans practiced what was known as the trans-Saharan slave trade, where slaves from sub-Saharan Africa were sold to North Africa. Africa had very powerful kingdoms and empires which engaged in warfare with one another for various reasons, including territorial disputes, control of resources, and ideological differences. While there were many instances of cooperation and trade between African societies, conflict was also a common feature of political relations on the continent. One example of such conflict was the long-standing rivalry between the kingdoms of Ghana and Mali in West Africa. The two kingdoms were both major players in the trans-Saharan trade, and their competition for control of trade routes and resources led to a number of conflicts. In the 11th century, the kingdom of Ghana was conquered by the Almoravids, a Muslim dynasty from North Africa. This led to a power vacuum, which was eventually filled by the kingdom of Mali, which rose to prominence in the 13th century. The two kingdoms engaged in a series of wars and raids over the centuries, with each side seeking to gain the upper hand in the lucrative trans-Saharan trade. Another example of inter-kingdom conflicts was the rivalry between the Kingdom of Benin and the Kingdom of Dahomey in present-day Benin. The two kingdoms were both power centers in the region, and their competition for resources and territory led to a number of conflicts over the centuries. The Kingdom of Dahomey was known for its aggressive expansionism, and it eventually conquered the Kingdom of Benin in the late 19th century. After such wars, the powerful African kingdoms and empires enslaved people from weaker kingdoms and empires. Slavery was a complex institution in Africa prior to the arrival of European traders, and many African societies practiced forms of slavery that involved debt bondage, capture and warfare, or other forms of forced labor. Moreover, some African societies engaged in the enslavement of people from other societies as part of their military conquests or as a means of acquiring wealth and power. Though the treatment of the captured slaves were not as severe as those practiced by the Europeans, the captured slaves were beaten, tortured, and made to do forced labor. Some slaves were sold to other Africans and used for debt settlement. This practice went on for many years. When the Europeans set foot in Africa in the 15th century, the transatlantic slave trade started. This practice went on till the 19th century. Within this period, more than 12.5 million Africans were shipped to the Americas as slaves to work in plantations. The slave trade lasted over 3 centuries, and this period is considered the darkest period in human history. When the Europeans started capturing slaves and transporting to the Americas, they used several methods including force, manipulation, and other Africans. They came with guns and other sophisticated weapons, which they used to outpower their captors. When European slave traders arrived on the West African coast, they disrupted existing social and economic structures and created new incentives for the capture and sale of slaves. First, it is important to understand that the transatlantic slave trade was driven by European demand for enslaved people, and that European slave traders played a major role in initiating and perpetuating the trade. European traders established coastal forts and trading posts along the African coast, where they exchanged goods such as textiles, weapons, and alcohol for enslaved people who were captured by African intermediaries. In some cases, African intermediaries may have captured people from rival ethnic groups and sold them to European traders, often in exchange for goods that were highly valued in their societies. However, it is important to note that the motivations of African intermediaries were complex and often influenced by political, economic, and social factors. Some intermediaries may have participated in the trade as a means of gaining power and resources, while others may have been coerced or manipulated by European traders. Some powerful African leaders who already had slaves easily sold those slaves to the Europeans because they did not know exactly what the Europeans wanted to do with the slaves. Most of them did not know what awaited the slaves. If you really think about it, if African did not sell other Africans, how did the few Europeans who arrived manage to go into the hinterlands and capture all these slaves without middlemen? How did they know their way around? And how did they know here to find the strongest and healthiest people to capture? Yes, they did most of the capturing, but the truth is some Africans aided them. To be honest, there were several differences between the slave trade practiced in Africa and the transatlantic slave trade, such as 1. With the slavery practiced in Africa before the Europeans came, slaves could regain their freedom after serving their master for a while, and children of slaves were not considered as slaves, whereas the transatlantic slave trade, slaves were considered as properties, and once you were a slave for life, including your children and children's children. 2. Unlike the transatlantic slave trade where slaves were given inhumane treatments, slaves in Africa could integrate the family and became members of the community after a while. 3. Mostly men were involved in the slave trade practiced in Africa, whereas during the transatlantic slave trade, men, women, and children were involved. 4. Africans who were transported to the Americas were used as baby-making machines so as to continue the lineage of slaves. Meanwhile, in Africa, slaves were not used as baby machines. Overall, the transatlantic slave trade was a complex and multifaceted historical phenomenon, but we cannot deny the simplistic narratives of African complicity or European dominance. It is essential to approach this history with nuance and sensitivity, and to recognize the diverse experiences and perspectives of the people who were involved. It is also important to acknowledge that the legacy of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade is complex and multifaceted, and that it continues to impact our world today. To conclude, it has been established that the slavery that existed within Africa before the arrival of the Europeans was totally different from the transatlantic slave trade. However, it will be unfair to completely push the narrative that at no one point in time did Africans enslave other Africans, or that Africans did not sell other Africans to the Europeans, because they actually did, just that in a very small percentage. Most of them were manipulated and coerced to do it, but some of them did it for their own selfish reasons. Here are some other facts about the transatlantic slave trade. 1. The slave trade had a profound impact on the economies of Europe, Africa, and the Americas. European countries such as Portugal, Spain, France, and England were heavily involved in the trade, and the profits from the trade were used to finance industries such as banking, shipping, and manufacturing. 2. The trade in enslaved people was brutal and inhumane. Enslaved Africans were often captured by European slave traders or African intermediaries and transported to the coast, where they were held in slave forts before being loaded onto ships for the transatlantic voyage. The conditions on these ships were extremely harsh, with many slaves dying of disease, malnutrition, or dehydration. 3. Once they arrived in the Americas, enslaved Africans were forced to work long hours in grueling conditions, often on plantations that produced crops such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton. Slaves were treated as property by their owners and were often subjected to brutal physical punishment and psychological abuse. 4. The transatlantic slave trade also had a profound impact on African societies, disrupting traditional social structures and economies and contributing to political instability and conflict. The loss of millions of people also had a devastating demographic impact, with some regions experiencing significant population declines. 5. The transatlantic slave trade was eventually abolished in the 19th century due to the efforts of abolitionists who argued that slavery was morally wrong and violated basic human rights. However, the legacy of slavery and racial discrimination continues to be felt in contemporary society, with many scholars arguing that the enduring effects of slavery continue to shape economic and social disparities in the Americas and around the world. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and let's continue the conversation from there. It is important to be respectful and explain your opinion in a constructive and educative way, rather than being rude. Thanks for watching this video. If this is your first time on the channel, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notification so you don't miss any of our videos.